Guys, so today we're gonna do part 2. I meant to do this earlier in the week, but I was having it a bit rough. So we're doing it today. I might actually do it back to back. I don't know yet. Yeah. Sorry for the long pause. I was just thinking. So we're gonna do about 10 pages here. Because again, this chapter is about 30 pages long, which is a bit long for compared to the other ones. So I'm just gonna have to guess about where I want to stop. Somewhere in there. And I'm gonna try not to cry while I say this. So I'm gonna dedicate this one to my grandma Pooja, who I was informed this morning passed away, peacefully, thankfully. So yeah, we'll see how this goes, guys. Here we go. And just so you guys maybe remember, we left off with Martha coming home. So I'm gonna start in with the kids telling her what to go do. Why, bless your heart alive, my dear. How late you are, said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her, and with officious zeal. We'd a deal of work to finish up last night, replied the girl, and I had to clear away this morning, mother. Well, never mind, so long as you are come, said Mrs. Cratchit. Sit ye down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm. Lord bless ye. No, no, cried there's father coming, cried the two young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. Hide, Martha, hide. Excuse me. So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, and at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fridge, hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. Why, where's our Martha? Cried Bob Cratchit, looking round. Not coming, said Mrs. Cratchit. Not coming, said Bob, with a sudden declension in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from church, and had come home rampant. Not coming upon Christmas Day? Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only a joke. So she came up prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the 2 young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash house, that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. And how did little Tim behave? Well, because I'm so ingrained to say Tiny Tim, little Tim wants to be little Tiny Tim. Asked Mrs. Cratchit when she had rallied Bob on his credulity. And Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. As good as gold, said Bob, and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people saw him in the church, because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. Only this was true. Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister, so to his stool before the fire. And while Bob, turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and round, and put it on the hob to simmer, Master Peter, who had two ubiquitous young Cratchits. Would you say ubiquitous or ubiquitous? Ubiquitous. Young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon, to which a black swan was a matter of course. And in truth it was something very like it in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy, ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor, and Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their posts, crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it in the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all around the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife, and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by the applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet every one had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits, in particular, were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it, while they were merry with the goose, a supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hullo! A great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with the laundress's next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top. Wow, I'm doing really bad today. You're gonna forgive me. Oh, a wonderful pudding, Bob Cratchit said calmly too, that he regarded it as great success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Gosh, just the idea of putting on fire is a little bit, whew. I don't know if this is still a tradition, guys, but if it is, good on you. Sounds terrifying. Having my food on fire, I just want to eat it. Mrs. Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind, she would confess she had had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last the dinner was all done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and fire made up. The compound of the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovel full of chestnuts on the fire. When all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers, and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to all of us, my dears. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant chair," said the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit, say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here." "What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. "Man," said the ghost, "if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Oh God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronounce on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust." Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground. But he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed!" cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." Just imagine Miss Piggy being Mrs. Cratchit in that moment. "My dear," said Bob, "the children. Christmas Day." "It should be Christmas Day, I'm sure," said she, "on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day." "I'll drink to his health for your sake and the day's," said Mrs. Cratchit, "not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness in it. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care 2 pence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for a full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge the Baleful being done with. Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6 pence weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtful at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he would favor when he came into the receipt of that bewildering income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, then told them what kind of work she had to do, and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest. Tomorrow being a holiday she passed at home. Also, how she had seen a countess and a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter, in which Peter pulled up his collar so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. All this time the chestnuts and the jug went round, and by they had a song about a lost child traveling the snow from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sang it very well. There was nothing of high marks in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were very happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. So we're going to leave off with that, the Cratchit family, which is a nice scene. As you might have noticed, the video is a little bit different after a certain part. My battery died. I really got to get better at this timing of the battery. So for today, I was going to talk to you guys about more about the present, but as I said at the start of this video, I'm not exactly feeling super spirited, so I'll probably maybe talk about it next time or the time after, but I wanted to, I guess, remind you guys, you know, and this is a good scene to have left off at before this, to just kind of remind you that your family is important, whether this is your biological family or your chosen family, because some people do have seriously toxic families and had to live without them because it was just awful for them, and you've chosen families through friends. To just remember to appreciate them, especially during this Christmas season, and especially during this 2020 pandemic season. I hope you all are doing your best to limit your contact with, like, physical contact with people, but not your emotional contact with people. Video calls have been a staple of my life since I had moved away from my family, first to South Dakota and then to Japan for the past 9 years, if we include South Dakota. And although I miss my family and I rarely get to go home, we really are blessed to have the internet right now. Gosh, if all of this happened with letters, I wouldn't have found out anything about my grandmother until probably maybe this spring. If I was lucky, you know? Like, just think about that. During this time period, unless you were literally right next door to your family, you didn't give information for weeks, months after the fact. Even though at that point there was much more technology, that it's still just remember to be thankful for the family you have, whether it was chosen or chosen for you. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time.